All right, in this concept video, I want to cover two things, buttons and state or state variables. So let's first start out by looking at kind of where we are at this point. Now, we've already gone through some code alongs where we've created a rectangle or a square, and we've colored it with a color and we've given it a corner radius and a size. And we know that we can do that based on the code that we see over here. And this is what we've really kind of focused on so far. We haven't really talked about what are these things around it. So essentially, every view, or when we start out, the system will call it a content view, is something that's created by Swift UI. Obviously, when you launch an app on your phone, it's got to have a view. It has to have something there. And this is where it all starts with this content view. And then inside that, there is a property right here called body. And it could have been called anything, but the default for this stuff is body. So every content view that is of type view has a property called body, which is of some view. That's an opaque type. Don't worry about that. None of that really matters for this course. But what does matter is that you understand that this struct and this property have to be there. And then remember, we can only have one view inside this, right? We could put a VStack there and put other things inside of it, but at this root level here, we can only have one view. And then of course, we just close the brackets here so that we have the proper nesting. So now let's take a look at first the areas that I want you to kind of get introduced to and focused on when we look at something like this. So what I'm going to do is just expand this out. So this is exactly what we saw in the previous slide, but we have two areas here that I want you to think about. Now in this concept video, we're not going to use this area down here, but we will as we get to future videos. But up here, we are going to use this area here. And this is an area where you can declare additional properties of your content view. So just like any other struct, you can have as many properties as you want. We have to have the var body. We know that that's required, but we can also go in and add some additional ones up here. So I bring that up because that'll be important as we think about a property that's going to hold the color or the state of the color of this square. So if I add that in at this point, we can create a new property called color, and it is of type color.blue. So we've created essentially a color property that is of the value blue, okay? And that color property is what gets carried down here. So you'll notice if we go back, here we had dot blue right here, right? But now when I add in this new variable color, I can now use that variable down here in the foreground color. So essentially the value that is here, what's stored in this property or variable, is actually used here. It's red here, and that foreground color is now blue because that's what we've set it to here, and that's what we're going to see over here. So let's look at how we might go about attaching a button on the square itself. So the square becomes the button, nice big button to tap. And when we tap it, we want to set it to red. Let's say that's our example. So what we're going to do is we want to get to this point, red, and that means that this value right here for this property called color, if it got set to color.red, if we changed it right in the code, it would get red here and it would show up as red. Okay, but what we want to do is do that dynamically with a button tap. So the first thing we're going to do is expand this out. We're going to go back to this color blue for a second, and we've got a new area in here that we want to add a new view, which in this case is a button. So when I bring that in, basically this is the form of the button that I like you to use. There are different ways that you can declare a button and use it, but I think for this course, this one is nice and easy. You basically have button. You have an open and close bracket right here. This right here is where the code is that you're going to run when a button is tapped. And label basically means like, well, it's implying the label could be a text field. Maybe it says to do something. In our case, it's actually going to be this rectangle. That's what's going to go inside here. But notice what we have right now. Here we have a button. And here we have a rectangle. And again, this is where we're going to do something on a tap, is right here. And right here is what we want the view being tapped. So whatever it is we're going to tap is going to be right here. Now, the interesting thing is the way this is written right now, this isn't legal. And remember, it's not legal because you can only have one view in this body property. Here we have two. We have the button, which is a view, and we have rectangle, which is a view. So I have two views in this view, and that is not legal. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take this rectangle piece and put it inside the label here. And when we do that, now the only thing that is in this hierarchy is the button. So we have the button, and we have still the area where we're going to execute code. And now we have the label, or what is it that the button is going to look like. In this case, it's our blue button, or it's our blue square, right? That's the label. So this is all good. So we're good to go now. So now what we want to think about is, what are we going to do here when the button is tapped to cause the square to turn red? Well, we already have a variable here. We have a property called color. It's been set to blue. If we put color equals color.red here, then you would think, well, gee, that would work because we're going to change this property to this new value. But remember, in structs, functions or anything inside them cannot modify properties on their own. They would have to be considered mutating functions. So the properties are always static. So if these are always static, then we can't change it. So we can't say color equals color.red, which we want to execute when the button's tapped, because this property right here is a property of a struct and it's not allowed to change. So we get around this by adding the @state property wrapper on to this variable. So this property gets an @state property wrapper, and by doing that, this is now something that can be modified. So this allows this to work. The other thing is that this state variable, because it's wrapped the way it is, means that it's completely visible to all of the UI here. And what'll happen is whenever this state variable changes, all of this UI will re-render. By re-rendering, I mean it's going to redraw itself on the screen. So that's what we want, really, because if I change this to red, then I want this to re-render with the color down here of red. So here's kind of the flow of this. First, over here, you tap. And remember, right in here is what code actually executes when you tap the button. So in here, we're going to set color equal to color.red. So when we do that, the color.red goes into this property, into this variable, which is really this variable up here, right? These are the same thing. This is where it's declared. This is where it's referenced. And because it's a state variable, it's allowed to be changed. So it's changed. Its internal value is now red. And if we come down here, this gets re-rendered, right? This is re-rendered because the state variable changed. So this gets run again. But now the foreground color is of color, which has been set to red. And sure enough, our square turns to a red. And that's basically the fundamental concept that I want you to understand. Essentially, any variables that you have up here, any properties that you have up here that you are going to reference in your UI, in other words, it's going to affect your UI in some form or fashion, needs to have the @state property wrapper around it. And when it is, that's going to allow this to compile right here, and therefore allow it to be changed. And when it's changed, this will get re-rendered. Now, the final thing is, well, how could we maybe do this where we toggled back and forth between two different colors? So when I tap it once, I show it as blue. I tap it again, I show it as red. Well, up here, we don't want to store the actual color up here. What we want to do is probably have a Boolean that just flips states. So when it's true, we'll do blue. When it's false, we'll do red, let's say. So we create a state variable, which is a Boolean. Why? Because it's inferred from this that it's a Boolean. And we're going to make it a state variable because we want to be able to change it, right? Then here in our button, we can do state.toggle. So when we toggle the value, every time we tap it, state if it's false is going to become true. If it's true, it's going to become false. And of course, when that happens, this re-renders. So down here is our little famous ternary if. And we use ternary ifs quite a bit in SwiftUI. So right here where this foreground color is stated, we're saying, well, if the state is true, we're going to do blue. If the state is false, we're going to do red. And so this will allow you to toggle back and forth between blue and red. So that is state variables and buttons, and that will be what you'll need for your next lab.